Welcome to TEPSA Talk, the podcast where leaders inspire, share, and grow together. TEPSA is dedicated to celebrating the incredible work happening in education. Each episode, we dive into meaningful conversations with leaders, change-makers, and innovators who are shaping the future of our schools. Whether you're looking for fresh ideas, encouragement, or a little spark to fuel your passion, TEPSA Talk is here for you. Imagine tuning in to hear how leaders are revolutionizing their schools, tackling challenges head-on, and fostering a culture of collaboration. Grab a coffee, hit play, and let's grow together. Welcome to TEPSA Talk.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the TEPSA Talk podcast. I'm your host, Todd Neslony, the Director of Culture and Strategic Leadership here at the Texas Elementary Principals and Supervisors Association. We're thrilled every week to bring you these thought leaders from around the world. And guys, you are in for a treat with this week's guest. It is best-selling author, educator, leader, speaker, amazing human, Nathan Maynard. Nathan, thank you so much for being our guest. Let everybody know a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you, Todd, for that introduction. A little bit about myself. I've been doing this work since 2008, this body of work, working on sort of reimagining discipline processes. What does it look like really to build levels of trust and connected communities? Started out as a youth worker for my first 7 years. I studied behavioral neuroscience at Purdue, and it was great to take some of the stuff I learned at the school and put it in real practice as a youth worker. Then I went into education. I was a teacher, then a school counselor, then assistant principal. And then my last job as an educator, I was a administrator at a school called Purdue Polytechnic High School. And I helped co-found that first school as a co-founding administrator. And it was sort of a project-based school, but leveled in all these different levels of my career, the same types of this restorative work and this discipline work to look at accountability, high expectations, but do it in a sense that's more brain aligned. So that's a little bit of my professional career. And then what I do now with High Five is I work with different schools across the nation, some international ones as well, looking at just reimagining their discipline processes with them.
I love it. And I love that you have so many unique experiences, not only with youth, but also in the education world, because I know that just makes what you do even deeper and more meaningful. But today's topic is transforming student behavior. And I know, as you said, you've got a lot of experience in this. And I know no matter where we go in the world right now, behavior is at the top of the list for so many educators and administrators. And so when we even begin to dive into this, it can feel overwhelming when you think about all the types of behavior issues we're seeing right now. So let's start small. Let's dive into this slowly and say, as we begin to consider this idea of transforming student behavior, where do we even begin?
Yeah, I would say the first way to begin is also like just the a little bit away from the students, but I think it's really important to understand what your school is currently doing around policies and procedures for more minor type behaviors, like those tier 1 type behaviors. Because I think sometimes we start with like our biggest high flyers in the school and we're like, okay, school's not working for this group of students. What can we do differently around it? And that's good to get to that level, but it starts with sort of the foundation. Like, what are we doing to support our educators? What resources do they need around those different behaviors? How do we understand behaviors before you start overlaying some different strategies involved with it? I've worked with a lot of different schools, and sometimes, early on in my career when I started as like just purely doing consulting, I would, come out and do professional development, do some strategies, but then you look at a school policy or a behavior matrix and you're like, wait a second, like as soon as this happens, then this happens. So we're setting almost our teachers up to like learn really cool things, but the policies aren't matching. So I'd say the first step's always just aligning a little bit with what's the process, what are we doing, and focusing on more of that tier 1 type behaviors.
Well, I love that that's kind of the mindset, because I think you said it exactly right. Sometimes we start with who are the biggest issues. Let's dive into that. But I've learned too, just like you said, sometimes those kids that are the frequent flyers become frequent flyers because of all these little bitty policy things that we have in place that is just built up over time, that now they just are upset about the whole system where anything causes them to lose their cool.
Exactly.
And so when thinking about these little shifts, though, In my experience as an administrator, sometimes it's really difficult to get the whole team on board
Of
with
course.
this, that this is how we're going to do things. It may be way different than we've done it in the past, or it
Yep.
may just be a little bit different. But getting everybody on that same mindset of how to deal with discipline, that was what often I struggled with, is how do I accomplish that? So I
Yep.
know that's a very big question
Yeah.
with a very complicated answer. But if
Yeah.
I'm an administrator listening today thinking, we're all over the place,
Yep.
like nobody defines it the same,
Yep.
what advice do you have for that administrator?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that, mindsets are a big part of this type of work, but I think that also perspectives are reality for everyone, as we know that, like, the famous quotes around this. I think the best way for school administrators to start getting people on the same page is facilitating vulnerable spaces to talk about the discipline issues in the school. And it's not just like, okay, here's new programming that's coming down, or here's like a new expert or a new book or a new admin that's coming over. Like, where's the vulnerability in the conversations where we're dropping down the hierarchies of who's who in the school and just talking openly about those types of needs? I also think that understanding the language that we're using is really important around behavior. So I
Yes.
would also say, like, a great first point, like if you're doing like staff circles and processing different things to get this ball rolling, even processing around, words like respect. What does respect mean to us as the educators in the building? How do we define this? Because if we're going to start holding kids accountable for not doing certain types of respect, but yet this teacher looks at respect this way than this teacher, then sometimes we butt into cultures, we start to push around things. So I think it's a lot about allowing there to be a safe space for the educators to speak openly, starting with defining some of that different language and what we do around that language, and then building in some of those different strategies of like forgiveness and empathy and belonging, like all that great stuff that we want in all our different schools. But we have to start with that vulnerable conversation of like, what does respect mean to you? I had a teacher one time at one of my buildings, and respect meant something different to that teacher than it did to
Yep.
me as the school administrator. And we would go into it a little bit when I would get a referral, and it would be like, okay, there wasn't eye contact made when they walked into the classroom, and it was more of this old school type of approach. But you can't just say, no, 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 we throw those referrals out, or no, 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 we don't do that, because then that teacher would feel, disrespected themselves, that they're trying to ask for help and not getting it. So I created a lot of sort of friction by having those little interpersonal conversations instead of just bringing the whole staff in, and not saying like, okay, this is one referral that I want to talk about, let's all see, and like push people against each other, but more of, okay, what does respect mean to our building? What does our policies say about that? What does our behavior matrix say when disrespect happens? X, Y, and Z happens, because kids need consequences, but I believe the punitive consequences takes away from the brain development of the power of this type of body of work. So a lot of those open conversations with educators are really powerful.
Okay, I could literally talk about this all day long. I
Yeah, yeah,
love so many of these things that you're saying,
yeah,
but you said something in there that I think really resonated with me, that we often forget when we work in education, and that is defining things. Because I
absolutely,
think we get caught into
absolutely.
this mindset of, you want to be a teacher, you went to school to be a teacher, or you've been a teacher for years. We
Yeah.
all know what this word means.
Yep.
And the reality is, no, we don't. Because the
Exactly.
way I
Exactly.
was raised defines that word very differently than the way you
Yes.
were raised. And you used a perfect example of even the word respect.
Yes.
What does respect mean? And that changes based upon my own experience, my own
Yes.
beliefs, my culture, like all those things changes
Exactly.
that. So I
Exactly.
love that. If you're an administrator listening now, it's like, that's the easiest way to start. Like, let's just
Exactly.
start defining stuff and getting
Yes.
everybody on the same
Yes.
page.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now you do this work though, like you and your group get to go to schools and organizations and really work on changing this. What does
Yes.
that look like when you go in and work with somebody?
Yeah, so I am a big data person, and I believe that to get the power of the collective together to move this needle forward, you have to use data. So what we developed was something called a dynamic needs assessment based on 6 different evidence bases, including restorative practices, trauma-informed care, implementation, all those types of things. And then what we did from that is we pulled different questions to validate those different metrics, so we can get a good understanding of the culture and the climate of the building before we ever start to work, or before we ever start to do any types of support support systems for it. So we're always starting out with like the data and understanding qualitative and quantitative metrics. Because again, early on in my career, you learn a lot when you first like leave the classroom or the education. I left as a school administrator, started doing consulting after Hacking School Discipline came out, and I would start going in and I was like, okay, well, I'm the expert. I know these strategies. I work with kids all over the world. I can do this type of stuff. But we weren't doing things that were looking at all of what's going on in the school building.
Right.
Like you can't just look at let's drop down referrals or let's drop down suspensions, because then what are we doing with those kids that are acting out, and and then does that drop down on teacher retention? So we always start out with something that's data informed to get us that types of metrics. And then from there, you go into really looking at that data and creating actionable plans with different metrics around that. So let's say that, I believe in the 80-20%, sort of ratio of classroom management. 80% is proactive, building relationships, sustaining, maintaining, 20% more conflict resolution, doing that type of stuff. So when we're looking at like the data, let's say, okay, we want to develop these 3 different proactive strategies and then track the effectiveness across with these different ones. Does that drop down referrals? Does that drop down suspensions? Okay, here's 2 different responsive things that we can do. When a kid comes down from the office and there's a referral that's X, Y, or Z, do we do conflict resolution through this? And what is the tracking of that? What's the recidivism around it?
Right.
And then continue to model. And I also think it's important to model these different practices, especially on the responsive side with our educators, because it's not just a layer of vulnerability that you have to have when you're opening up those doors to conversations, but you have to understand like what the pushback may be from the parents, from the students, what could go wrong, how do you navigate it, like I remember one time I was saying like, okay, we got to do phone calls home. This is a strategy that's going to help us. We looked at the data. Parents don't know the voices of our teachers right now. Let's do it. And then I came back to the school 3 months later, and then like very few people were still making phone calls.
Right.
Had the conversations, was open with them. And one of the teachers got like cussed out by one of the parents and then shared about how horrible that experience was. And then none of the other teachers wanted to like pick up that call and create that vulnerability. So then we role played phone calls and practice. Okay, if someone starts to get escalated, here's how you sort of handle this, because teachers don't deserve to get cussed out in a call. So what do we do to make sure that they feel prepared for it? And that's sort of how we do our support with our schools.
I love that. There's so many cool elements there. And
Yeah.
so, but you used a word there that I would love to get your definition on, just to provide
Yeah.
some clarity for those who are listening. And it's also the name of your masterclass that you're doing for us over
Yeah.
here at TEPSA. And that's the word trauma.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think that word can get thrown around a little bit right now, but so define for us trauma.
Yeah. So trauma is I would say, and again, like I never have like a set thing I'm going to say with stuff. So I'm trying to make sure I'm saying this correctly. I think when I'm thinking about trauma in more of a practical sense definition, I'm thinking about this is something that creates a new perspective of the world based on an event. And I think that event to certain people could not change your perspective. To other people, it may change your perspective on the world. And I also think looking at like adverse childhood experiences is a really good like concrete qualitative way to sort of also look at what trauma is sort of defined as. I think there's also like things like toxic stress that's not defined as trauma, but again, still has very similar impacts on the body, the brain development, the way our amygdalas, fight, flight, or freeze responds to situations. But I would say trauma is more around that event or something around it that educators sometimes have no idea that this is something that may be a trauma response, or that we're doing something that's causing a trauma response, because trauma responses come out of even a smell or a sound or things like that. And sometimes as educators, we have no idea that we're causing this type of stuff, and we're not meaning to. We have good intentions. I love the Brene Brown quote, like, we're all trying the best that we can around this and going through. So I think it's really, really, really important for us to understand that trauma isn't something that it's clearly X, Y, and Z. I think the ACEs show us that, but it's more of let's be open to understanding what the behavior is showing us, what's the behavior communicating, and what can we do to sort of create actionable things around that.
Well, and I love too that in that explaining that you also made clear that trauma doesn't affect each of us the same. And so
Absolutely.
what may
Absolutely.
be traumatic to one person might not be to another. And that doesn't mean that they're wrong or right. And I think
Yep.
acknowledging that there are things that set people up and there are things that people have been through and everybody's different. And if it matters to them, it's important. And we
For
have
sure.
to dive into that.
Yeah.
And so we are lucky enough here at TEPSA that you are going to be leading a masterclass
Yeah.
at our TEPSA Summer Conference this summer. Now, for those of you listening who don't know, we are doing a summer conference like we do every summer at the Kalahari in Round Rock, Texas. It is June 10th through 12th. But on June 10th, we offer something called masterclasses, which are 2.5-hour deep dives with specialists in that area who really can help you if this is an area you're trying to work in. It is an additional registration and fee because it is so involved. You get a reserved seat, you get all these other goodies.
Mhm.
And Nathan, you're leading one of those
Yeah.
about moving from trauma to trust and how to transform student behavior. And so if people are signing up for your masterclass, what are they going to get? Or if they're
Yeah.
listening and thinking, I might want to learn more from Nathan, what can they expect to have in that masterclass?
So yeah, and I would say the first thing is actionable things you can do with students that are experiencing or we're seeing trauma responsive type behaviors or ones to help us understand it. I think it's really important for us to understand that trauma may explain a behavior, but it doesn't excuse a behavior that may be causing harm to the educator or to other students in the class. But sometimes our sympathy kicks in and we say, okay, I know the lived experiences, or I know what this kid's going through, and it's okay that they're doing this, or it's okay that we're doing that. But then we start to lower our expectations down, and that creates sort of disruptions and sometimes more maladaptive behavior instead of more supportive behavior for kids with trauma. So if you come to this session, you're going to walk away with strategies, and you're going to walk away with real world examples of how this can work and ways to sort of co-construct some of those different strategies for your types of positions. Doing this type of work, I've worked in now over 20 countries and 36 states here in the United States. And the one thing I can say is kids' behavior is very similar around the world. And it's like you may see different this is our top behaviors, or this is the biggest thing that we're impacting. But kids, the way they behave is very easy to look at. It's two different types of motivations, extrinsic and intrinsic. Our trauma kids, sometimes we never can get to that intrinsic motivation because their behaviors are manifesting all this acting out behavior. So come into the session, we're going to talk about how to get to that intrinsic to help change that student's behavior and walk away with some really good solid strategies.
I love it. Well, guys, if you're listening today, I hope you go over to TEPSA, that's TEPSA.org, sign up for the summer conference today, register for Nathan's masterclass. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. I am obsessed with his book. It is fantastic. And Nathan, if people want to connect with you on a level and try to pick your brain some more, how can they connect with you?
Yeah, I would say my best platform right now is LinkedIn. I really like LinkedIn, and it's just my first and last name. And also, we have a website called High5, all one word, .school. And you can also check out sort of what we're doing on high5.school. We publish a lot of research papers, lit reviews. We're publishing 2 papers around neurodiversity with Cambridge University right now. So again, we would love to sort of share those resources and be around. So LinkedIn or our website, high5.school.
Awesome. Well, Nathan, thank you so much for being a guest. Thank you, everybody, for listening or watching another episode of the TEPSA Talk podcast. Remember, you can check out all the past episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your stuff. It's there. We'll see you again next week with another all-new episode.
Awesome.